Hi, it's Joseph here back for another video of P&G. Today I want to talk about how do we know if something is evidence-based in education. At the end of the day, evidence just means that there's an argument to be made from something, usually within scientific journal articles or peer-reviewed papers. But there's different levels of evidence, and we have to look at these perspectives within these lenses. So, for example, one of the most common types of evidence we see is rationalistic evidence. So I'll give you an example of rationalistic evidence. We could say that giving students more choice in the classroom might make them more engaged, happier, and thus learn more, which is a perfectly reasonable idea and hypothesis to make. However, we can go further than that. We can do a qualitative study, and a qualitative study would observe an idea or a principle in the classroom, look at theory written about said idea, and try to make some judgments about the validity of a claim. So we could take a teacher who's increasing the amount of choice they offer students in the classroom, and we could observe to see if we think there's value for that class. We could write a paper about it afterwards. That's called a qualitative study. This type of evidence is sort of a low level of evidence. And it's unfortunately some of the most popular type of evidence we see when people make that claim, teaching strategy is evidence-based. The next level up is sort of a quantitative study. And there's different tiers and types of studies, and some are better than others, but I won't get into that in this episode. So ideally, what we'd have is a control group and an experiment with a large sample size, hopefully at least a couple hundred students, and we'd test a teaching principle, like, for example, inquiry-based learning. We'd have one group of students who are using inquiry-based learning and one group who are not, hopefully more than one class, and we'd see which one outperformed the other group. And then we would use something called an effect size to analyze those results to determine the statistical relevance of that. So we get an effect size by, there's a couple different ways you can do it, but the most common way is we take the mean difference between the two groups, and then we divide it by the standard deviation. So we can interpret this in a standardized way, and I'll show you that. I'm just going to share my screen for a second because, I'm a little bit of a dinosaur, sadly, and I'm not that great with technology. So sharing the screen is easier for me. Anyway, so I've shared my screen, and here's a guide just on Wikipedia that anyone can find on how to interpret an effect size. So below 0.01, very small. Below 0.20, small. We have a medium size around 0.5, a large effect size around 0.8, very large around 1.2, and huge or super effect size at 2.0. By the way, that's a real term. I love it. It takes a huge nerd to label something super. The only other time I've seen super used in science is supernova. Anyways, moving on, then we can use this to determine if a study has good or bad results, for lack of a better term, or to say if a strategy is evidence-based off of a study. Now, this sounds reasonable. Of course, what ends up happening is everyone makes the age-old claim, well, one study says this and one study says that. I'm sure everyone has heard people say, a study came out last month saying eggs are good for me, and a study will come out next month saying eggs are bad for me. And I went through this recently because I was looking at Kumon studies. I was doing a secondary meta-analysis on, I shouldn't say secondary, and meta-analysis on Kumon in the classroom to see if Kumon helps students. And I came across 5 studies, the largest of which had an effect size that was enormous of 3.5, and the smallest had a negative effect size of negative 0.39. So in one study, we see a massive improvement in math scores based off of adding Kumon, and in another, we see student scores go down, and then we see 2 in the middle and 1 high performing but not massive. So the next question is, well, how do we deal with this? And there's actually a really simple answer. It's not that, I think there's some people who will have you believe, well, therefore truth is relative and we can't decide. We've actually invented a scientific process to deal with this, and it's called meta-analysis. We use statistical tools to average out the result of these studies to get one result. So I averaged out these results, and I found a mean effect size of 1.07. There's a couple of different ways we could analyze that, and I've included that below, but that's for another episode. So this tells us that Kumon, generally speaking, is fairly high yield. Now, there's other ways, though, we can look at this, because oftentimes I think it's best not to look at education studies in a vacuum, even within the context of meta-analysis, because there's so many teaching factors out there that exist. There's hundreds of teaching strategies you could choose from. And every scholar I've ever interviewed on my podcast maintains that their teaching strategy is amazing and every teacher should use it, but teachers don't have time to do that. So the question then becomes, well, which ones do we use and how do we know which ones we can use? And I would suggest, similar to John Hattie, and I'm influenced by him quite a bit, that we should compare the effect sizes of teaching strategies and see which ones have the most research to support them. So I'll show you John Hattie's website, or one of them, I should say. And this is an analysis he does every year looking at teaching strategies, looks at the top 250 or so teaching strategies and compares the results. So the ones at the top have the most evidence in support of them. So collective teacher efficacy, self-reported grades, teacher estimates of achievement, cognitive task analysis, response to intervention. And the ones in the bottom of the list have the lowest impact. So humor, multi-grade age classes, teacher performance pay, college halls of residence, etc. And the ones in the middle are sort of average results. In fact, the average impact size of a teaching study is 0.4. Now, something you got to remember is that when people do these studies, they tend not to report the results if they're not significant. So this can sort of inflate them. But the average effect size of a teaching study is 0.4, which means that we have a moderate effect to most studies. So we have to also consider the time efficiency of something, though. So some things are really quick and easy to implement and might have a low yield, like homework. Homework has a very low yield effect size, but it's very easy for a teacher to implement because it's very little extra work for the teacher. Whereas something like teaching to learning styles has a relatively low effect size and is quite complex and challenging for a teacher to do. Ergo, it's probably not a good idea to implement in your classroom. Now, I'm not saying that no one should ever do this or use classroom or teaching to learning styles. What I am saying is that the evidence in support of it is quite weak according to meta-analysis. So I think this can be sort of a basic strategy for how teachers can make that quick snap to judgment and decision as to what's evidence-based and what's not. Now, there is nuance to this though, and qualitative studies can be great for teasing out the nuance because this type of study tells us, is a strategy highly effective or not highly effective? But it doesn't tell us, is a strategy highly effective in a certain scenario or situation? And we can find studies that do that, but John Hattie's work isn't going to do that. So for example, inquiry-based learning has a fairly low effect size. However, we can see in the research that it's really good for certain things. So inquiry-based learning teaches students how to critically think, how to be self-independent, how to work on their own, how to learn basically. And this is a really powerful thing that students need to learn and develop the skills for. But it tends to take away from their learning of facts and memorization. So when we're having students in early grades who are trying to learn, say, basic math facts and grammar rules and vocabulary, it's probably not a good time. And this is actually borne out in the literature too. Meta-analysis has shown that inquiry-based learning tends to have higher results for older students than it does for younger students. And we can also think it might make more sense to have it for certain subjects. Science is all about inquiry and the process of inquiry. Ergo, I think it makes a lot of sense to use inquiry-based learning in a science class. But I don't think it makes a lot of sense to use inquiry-based learning in a grade 1 math class. I hope this video helped you guys today to understand my perspective on what is evidence-based and what is not. And until next time, bye for now.